Without objection. Senator from Utah.
I have to raise an objection, so I object.
Oh, Senator from Utah.
Oh, Mr. President, I have to raise an objection, so I object.
Yes, sir. Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 330, S2122, a bill to repeal the Medicare sustainable growth rate offset by repealing the Obamacare individual mandate. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read a third time and passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, today the Senate will vote on H.R. 4302. This is a bill that will extend for 1 year the so-called dog fix relating to the sustainable growth rate, or SGR formula. Patching the SGR has become a regular item of business here in the Congress. Indeed, it's basically an annual ritual that we have to go through here. From the first day the SGR went into effect in 2002, Congress has acted to prevent its reimbursement cuts to physicians from going into effect in order to ensure the Medicare beneficiaries continue to have access to quality care.
In order to proceed to executive session, would you like to ask unanimous consent to make
I would ask unanimous consent that we proceed to executive session and that my remarks be placed immediately thereafter.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, John B. Owens of California to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit.
Under the previous order, the time until 5:30 p.m. will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
If I can have the first part of this, my remarks placed in the record at this point, I'd appreciate it.
Without objection.
Okay. From the first day the SGR went into effect in 2002, Congress has acted to prevent its reimbursement cuts to physicians from going into effect in order to ensure the Medicare beneficiaries continue to have access to quality care. More often than not, SGR patches have been cobbled together at the last minute between the leadership offices of both parties. They are usually tacked onto larger pieces of legislation without the input of members and without the benefit of going through a committee. For years, this process has bothered members of the Congress who, like me, want to see transparency and regular order return to the legislative process. It has also bothered seniors and physicians who are constantly worried about whether the gridlock in Congress is going to finally send them over the SGR cliff. There is bipartisan support for repealing and replacing the SGR, or the sustainable growth rate. And to the surprise of many, progress has been made to do just that. For more than a year, a bipartisan, bicameral group of members of Congress worked to fully repeal the SGR and replace it with more reasonable reforms that move Medicare's antiquated fee-for-service reimbursement system for physicians toward a system that rewards doctors for providing quality care based on health outcomes. I was part of that group, as was former Senator Max Baucus. Chairman Baucus and I worked for months to produce an SGR repeal bill here in the Senate. Eventually, that bill sailed through the Finance Committee with broad bipartisan support. At the same time, the two relevant House committees, the Ways and Means Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, also reported a bill to repeal the SGR. That in and of itself would have been quite a feat. However, we weren't done yet. Realizing that we were close to achieving our goal, the chairman and ranking members of all three relevant committees, that's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, decided to come together to find a single unified approach that both parties in both chambers could support. At the time, there were a lot of naysayers. Indeed, given Congress's recent track record, there were reasons to be skeptical. However, by consulting with all the relevant stakeholders and hearing their recommendations and concerns, we were able to craft a policy that is near unanimous support across the healthcare community. That's right, Mr. President. For the first time since the SGR was enacted in 1997, Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate are united behind a policy that gets rid of this flawed system once and for all. However, we can't get ahead of ourselves. From the outset of this process, Chairman Baucus and I, along with our House counterparts, agreed that any legislation to repeal and replace the SGR must be fiscally responsible. Without any offsets, this policy would add roughly $180 billion to the deficit if we don't have offsets. If it's going to pass in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and if we're going to maintain the same level of bipartisan support for the package, we need to find offsets that both parties can support. It's kind of miraculous we've come together, but both the bilateral and bipartisan people who have worked on this have agreed that we have to have solid offsets. And in the months since we reached an agreement on the underlying policy, all the parties involved have been working to find suitable offsets. I'm not going to disparage anything. This is a difficult process, but it has to be done. And despite the bipartisan goodwill this process has engendered, there have been some who were not satisfied with our progress. And with today's SGR deadline looming, there was an effort to hijack this bipartisan process and turn it into yet another partisan sideshow. With an agreement in place and with parties still at the negotiating table, some of my friends on the other side of the aisle thought it would be preferable to simply bring our bill to the floor and demand a vote either without offsets or with offsets they knew Republicans would not be able to support. In other words, Mr. President, they wanted to force our bipartisan policy through the Senate on a partisan basis and then jam the House with it. This was, to say the least, disappointing to me. Here we have a historic opportunity to do something that will help people throughout this country and do it with the type of broad bipartisan consensus that is all too rare in Washington these days. Yet there were still some who would prefer to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory and set up yet another political showdown destined to end a partisan stalemate. Needless to say, I'm glad that eventually cooler heads prevailed, which brings us to today's vote. The SGR patch that we will be voting on today is not perfect. However, I'm not going to make the perfect the enemy of the good. The bill before us today is a good faith effort to move the ball forward, thanks to the good work of Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Reid. What we need now is time to get this done the right way, and this bill will give us that. So for these reasons, I plan to vote in favor of the SGR bill before us today. I urge my Senate colleagues to do the same. And once this legislation is signed into law, we need to get back at the negotiating table, and I have no doubt that my friend, the distinguished senator from Oregon, as he always has, will work with me and others in order to resolve these problems that have arisen. And like I said, there are 3 committees with jurisdiction over the SGR issue. We all need to work together to find a responsible path forward. Hopefully, the bill that we'll vote on today would put an end to the unnecessary distractions and roadblocks that have been thrown in our path. Mr. President, this is an important vote today, and I'm very grateful to those who are willing to support what we're at least trying to do. And I want to thank all concerned. With that, I yield the floor.